The sit in the psychological sense is far more than a simple expression of physical desire. It is a symbolic movement of the psyche, often rooted in a much deeper and often unconscious longing, a hunger not for another body, but for a lost piece of ourselves. To understand lust at this level, one must begin to recognize that the objects of our desire are often mirrors of our inner world, carrying projections that belong not to them but to aspects of our psyche that have not yet been brought into consciousness. What we chase outside of ourselves is often what we have not dared to face within. This internal phenomenon is closely tied to the archetypal patterns that govern the deeper layers of the unconscious mind. In the male psyche, for instance, there exists an archetypal image known as the anima, the inner feminine principle, which reflects emotion, relational depth, sensitivity, and receptivity. In the female psyche, the corresponding figure is the animus, the inner masculine, associated with assertiveness, rational thought, and spiritual direction. These archetypal energies live within us all, regardless of gender, and they act as bridges between our conscious ego and the deeper, transpersonal dimensions of the self. However, when these inner figures are not integrated, when they remain unconscious, they are inevitably projected onto external individuals. This is why people often find themselves irresistibly drawn to certain figures, sometimes with overwhelming intensity. The experience of lust in this context is often not directed toward the real person as they truly are, but toward the psychic image that has been cast upon them. The intensity of desire does not come from the individual's characteristics themselves, but from the psychic weight of the projection they carry. The beloved becomes a screen upon which the unconscious has cast an idealized or forbidden image. This is why lust often feels irrational, consuming, and out of proportion. It is not about the other person, it is about what they represent to the soul. Something lost, something exiled, something that calls us back toward a forgotten unity. But this projection is dangerous, not because of its moral implications, but because of what it costs the psyche. When we project this anima or animus onto another and then chase after them as if they are the answer to our longing, we disempower ourselves. We externalize the inner quest and become dependent on the other for what is in truth an inner integration. In other words, lust in this archetypal sense is the attempt to resolve a spiritual need through physical or emotional possession. But such attempts are always doomed to fail, because the true object of the desire lies not in the outer world, but within. The more unconscious we are of this dynamic, the more compulsive and enslaving lust becomes. It no longer serves the natural erotic rhythm of life, which connects people in love, intimacy, and mutual growth. Instead, it becomes a tyrant, demanding satisfaction, yet never fulfilled. Each conquest deepens the illusion. Each satisfaction intensifies the craving. We begin to mistake the search for wholeness with the pursuit of others, when in fact it is our own soul that we are longing for. The inner feminine or masculine has not been met, so we chase its reflection in the outer world, hoping that physical union will compensate for psychic division. What is crucial here is to understand that projection, though natural, must be withdrawn if one is to evolve. The inner figures must be recognized for what they are, parts of the self demanding attention. When one stops chasing lust, one is not renouncing desire itself, but rather the illusion that the other holds the key to one's completion. It is a shift from external pursuit to internal dialogue. When the anima is reclaimed from the projection, she becomes a guide to the depths of feeling, imagination, and soulfulness. The animus, once withdrawn, becomes a voice of clarity, strength, and inner direction. These inner companions, once integrated, grant a sense of psychic wholeness that no external relationship can provide on its own. There is a subtle truth embedded in this. To chase lust is often to avoid the deeper encounter with one's own loneliness, vulnerability, and longing. Lust offers distraction from the inner emptiness, but this emptiness is not a problem to be fixed. It is the doorway to depth. It is where the self speaks in whispers and symbols and dreams. To remain still before it, rather than to flee into desire, is an act of profound courage. For it is in that silence that the unclaimed parts of the psyche begin to stir, the fantasies begin to dissolve, and what remains is the raw, unvarnished material of the soul itself, wounded, beautiful, and waiting to be known. In this context, lust becomes not a sin or a flaw, but a symptom. It is the soul crying out for unity, for the reconciliation of opposites, for the return of the exiled self. The error lies in mistaking the outer for the inner, the other for the self. This is why relationships that begin with intense lust often collapse under the weight of unmet psychic needs. The lover cannot carry the projection forever. When they fall short of the image, disillusionment follows, and the cycle begins again with another until one learns to withdraw the projection, integrate the inner figures, and stand alone in one's own psychic totality. The chasing will never cease. And yet, when the projection is withdrawn and the inner work is done, something extraordinary happens. The need to chase dissolves. One no longer seeks from others what can only be found within. And paradoxically, this is when true connection becomes possible, not from lack, but from fullness, not from craving, but from wholeness. The other is no longer a substitute for the self, but a companion on the journey. And lust, when it appears, is no longer compulsive, but integrated into the rhythm of love, eros, and creation. To stop chasing lust, then, is to turn inward, not in repression, but in reverence. It is to enter into a deeper relationship with oneself, to recognize the symbolic meaning of desire, and to reclaim the energy that has been scattered across the faces of others. It is a journey back to the self, where true transformation can begin. The act of chasing outward gratification, whether it be lust, power, admiration, or recognition, is a sign that the psyche has not yet found its center. The modern individual is driven by many currents, often without realizing that these forces arise not from necessity, but from inner fragmentation. The chase for fulfillment in the external world reflects a spiritual restlessness, a deep unease with the present state of the self. This restlessness is often mistaken for ambition or passion, but more often than not, it is rooted in a disconnection from the inner ground of being. The individual becomes like a leaf tossed about by wind, caught in pursuit of objects that promise satisfaction, but only temporarily silence the deeper unrest. To chase something is to give it power over you. It is to assume that what you seek exists outside your own nature, and that only through possession of it will peace be achieved. This assumption, however, is rooted in illusion. The world becomes a battleground when we believe that what we need is held by something or someone else. We begin to compete, to manipulate, to strive endlessly, yet the object of desire always seems just out of reach, or once attained, it dissolves into disappointment. The world resists our grasp because we are acting from lack rather than from fullness. We do not realize that the very energy we spend in pursuit is being siphoned away from the process that could bring true power, inner integration. Power in the deeper psychological sense does not come from domination or accumulation, but from the unification of the psyche. The more divided we are within ourselves, the more chaotic our external life becomes. When parts of the self remain unconscious, when the shadow is repressed, when the inner feminine or masculine remains unrecognized, we experience a loss of inner authority. This loss creates a vacuum, and into that vacuum rushes the impulse to seek completion through external means. But the world cannot provide what the soul has disowned. No amount of success or sexual conquest or admiration will compensate for the absence of inner harmony. The process of individuation, the realization of one's true and whole self, requires a withdrawal from external identification and a turning inward. This is not the withdrawal of avoidance, but of radical honesty. It is the courage to face what has been hidden, denied, or projected. When a person begins to walk this path, they often discover that much of what they thought they needed was in fact a distraction from deeper work. The chase itself becomes transparent. It is seen for what it is, an escape from inner responsibility. And yet, paradoxically, when one ceases to chase, the world begins to respond differently. The outer world is no longer seen as an arena for proving oneself or achieving wholeness, but as a mirror of the inner state. The more centered one becomes, the more life seems to unfold without force. What was once resisted is now magnetized. What was once pursued begins to arrive. This is not because the world has changed, but because the relationship to it has shifted. The person who has reclaimed their psychic energy no longer operates from compulsion. They act, but not from craving. They desire, but not from emptiness. They relate, but not in order to fill a void. Their actions arise from an inner stillness, a place untouched by the frantic movements of ego. This stillness is not passive. It is the source of genuine potency. When one is no longer enslaved by unconscious impulses, one becomes capable of intentional action. There is no longer a need to manipulate outcomes or seduce appearances. The world begins to respond to the authenticity of presence, not to the desperation of pursuit. It is a law of the psyche that what we resist within becomes mirrored without. The chaotic relationships, the recurring frustrations, the endless longing, they all reflect some aspect of the self that has not yet been claimed. When we chase lust, we are often running from loneliness. When we chase power, we are often compensating for inner weakness. When we chase admiration, we are often hiding self-rejection. And yet, when these inner truths are confronted directly, without judgment, without denial, they begin to lose their grip. The compulsion weakens, and what remains is not emptiness, but clarity. From that clarity, a new kind of power arises, not the power to control others, but the power to remain rooted in one's own being, regardless of circumstances. This rootedness has a profound effect on how the world responds to us. The person who has ceased to chase no longer disturbs the natural rhythm of life. They are in harmony with it. This harmony is felt by others, even if unconsciously. There is a gravitas in such a person, a quiet authority that does not need to speak loudly to be heard. Their presence alone alters the dynamic of a room, not because they are attempting to influence, but because they are no longer being pulled in every direction by unconscious desire. They are no longer seeking validation from others, and so they become strangely magnetic. The world, sensing the absence of craving, relaxes its resistance and opens itself in unexpected ways. This is the surrender of the world, not in submission to the will of the ego, but in alignment with the deeper self. When we stop projecting our needs outward, when we stop imagining that our salvation lies in others, we reclaim the energy that had been scattered. That energy becomes available for creativity, for relationship, for vision. We become capable of engaging with the world, not as beggars, but as participants, not as seekers, but as stewards of our own psychic life. In this state, nothing needs to be forced. Opportunities arise, not because we have chased them, but because we are prepared to meet them. Relationships deepen, not because we demand connection, but because we are capable of true intimacy. Success may come, but it is no longer the goal. It is a byproduct of alignment. The world surrenders not in defeat, but in recognition. It sees that the individual is no longer trying to possess it, and so it no longer needs to resist. This is not a philosophy of detachment in the cold or indifferent sense. It is a detachment born of fullness. A person who has ceased to chase is not numb or withdrawn. On the contrary, they feel more, not less, but their feelings are no longer the tyrants of their actions. Their desire is not eradicated, but purified. They live in the world, but they are not owned by it. They act, but they are not acted upon, and in this they find a strange and quiet power, one that does not need to chase because it has already arrived. When the compulsive chase for lust, power, or validation ceases, what emerges is not a void, but a profound return to the self. The energies that were once scattered in endless pursuit are reclaimed, and the fragmented psyche begins to unify. This integration brings a quiet strength, a magnetism that requires no performance. As inner conflict dissolves, so does the need to conquer the world. The world begins to respond in kind, not because it has changed, but because you have, by no longer needing to possess, you come into possession of yourself. This is where true power lives, not in the chase, but in the stillness from which all real transformation begins. Thank you for walking with me through this reflection. May your journey inward bring clarity, strength, and peace. Trust the process, and good luck as you continue your path toward deeper wholeness.